Imagine a bright, sunlit kitchen somewhere in a prosperous American suburb, sometime in the middle years of the 1950s, chrome fixtures gleaming, a fresh pot roast resting on the counter, a radio playing softly from a shelf near the window. From the street outside, through the wide picture window facing the front lawn, this kitchen and the woman standing in it look, in every visible respect, like the very picture of contentment the decade's magazines and advertisements promised on every glossy page. But tonight, we're going to step past that window into the quieter, less photographed rooms of this house and sit for a while with what a great many 1950s housewives actually carried behind their own closed doors. So let your breathing slow, let your shoulders soften, and let's step gently inside a decade that looked, from the outside, almost perfectly content. Let's begin with the sheer physical scale of the labour itself, because even with the genuinely new conveniences of this particular decade, housework in a 1950s home remained a full, demanding, near-constant occupation. A woman managing a household of this era, without the domestic helper wealthier Victorian counterparts might once have relied on, since even prosperous suburban families increasingly managed without live-in servants by this period, typically spent something in the range of 50 to 60 hours a week on housework alone, cooking, cleaning, laundry and childcare. A workload research conducted later in the century would confirm was, in raw hours, genuinely comparable to a full-time job, except that it came with no wage, no formal time off, and no clearly defined end to the working day. New appliances had undeniably reduced certain kinds of physical strain, but the era's rapidly rising standards for cleanliness, meal quality, and household presentation had risen right alongside them, meaning the actual time spent on housework across the decade, by some later research estimates, barely declined at all despite all the labour-saving machinery filling the era's kitchens and laundry rooms. A woman's day, in practice, rarely offered any genuine extended block of true rest, since even quiet stretches of apparent leisure were commonly filled with mending, ironing, or planning tomorrow's meals, work that simply didn't register, in the culture's own vocabulary, as work at all. Isolation, too, sat quietly at the centre of a great many 1950s housewives' daily experience, and it's worth pausing here, because this particular hardship rarely appears in the decade's own cheerful self-portrait. The rapid post-war growth of car-dependent suburban developments, often built at real physical distance from established city centres, meant that a housewife without her own car, which was, throughout much of the decade, still commonly the case in a single-car household, where the husband drove it to work each day, could find herself genuinely stranded at home for long unbroken stretches, her social world narrowed down to whichever neighbours happened to live within easy walking distance. Extended family, too, often lived considerably further away than had been typical in earlier generations, as the post-war years saw real, significant geographic mobility, young families relocating for a husband's career to entirely new cities and states, away from the mothers, sisters, and lifelong friends who might once have offered daily companionship and practical support. A woman spending her entire day alone with young children, in a house often several miles from the nearest genuine adult company, experienced a particular, quiet kind of loneliness that the era had, at the time, remarkably little accurate language to describe, since the prevailing culture insisted, with real and repeated conviction, that a woman surrounded by a loving husband healthy children, and a beautiful modern home had, by definition, everything a woman could reasonably want or need. Medically, too, the decade's actual treatment of women's genuine distress reveals something considerably darker than the cheerful surface suggests. Physicians throughout this era prescribed tranquilizers, most famously a particular sedative that became genuinely, remarkably common in medicine cabinets across suburban America by the decade's end, to housewives reporting vague, persistent symptoms of anxiety, exhaustion, and unhappiness. Medications intended to smooth over distress rather than to seriously investigate its actual underlying cause. A woman who raised real concerns about her own unhappiness with her doctor, her husband, or her minister. The three figures of authority a woman in this position was generally encouraged to turn to, was frequently met with reassurance that her feelings were simply a normal, if regrettable, part of a woman's naturally more nervous constitution, echoing in a genuinely striking way almost exactly the same medical framing applied to Victorian women's distress nearly a century earlier. Postpartum depression, in particular, went almost entirely unrecognized and untreated as a distinct medical condition throughout this decade. A new mother experiencing real, sometimes severe emotional difficulty following childbirth typically offered little beyond quiet reassurance that the feeling would pass on its own, with essentially no meaningful medical framework yet in place to properly identify or treat what she was actually experiencing. Marriages of this era, too, operated under real, largely unspoken strain that the decade's carefully composed public image worked hard to conceal. Divorce, while considerably more available than in earlier centuries, still carried real, significant social stigma throughout the 1950s, and a woman considering leaving an unhappy or even genuinely difficult marriage faced a daunting set of practical obstacles, limited independent financial resources of her own, in a world where most married women had little direct access to family income or credit in their own name. Real fear of losing custody of her children in a legal system that, while generally favouring mothers in custody matters by this point, could still be genuinely unpredictable, and the near certainty of significant social judgment from a community that viewed divorce, quite openly, as a mark of personal failure. This meant that a genuinely significant number of women throughout the decade remained within marriages marked by real unhappiness, emotional neglect, or, in a portion of documented cases, outright domestic abuse that the surrounding culture offered remarkably few resources or even accurate language to properly name or address, since the entire concept of domestic violence as a distinct, serious social and legal problem requiring genuine intervention would not gain widespread public recognition and infrastructure for a good many years still. Motherhood itself, meanwhile, carried its own particular, largely unspoken weight throughout this decade, shaped by genuinely intense new cultural expectations around exactly what a good mother owed her children. The era's newly popular, widely read parenting advice placed enormous emphasis on a mother's constant emotional attunement and near-total availability to her children's developmental needs, a genuinely demanding standard that, while representing real, meaningful progress from the more distant, formal parenting norms of earlier generations, also placed real, near-constant psychological pressure on mothers to manage not only their children's physical care, but their emotional development too, largely alone, largely without any meaningful practical support from a culture that offered essentially no institutional childcare, no paid parental leave in any meaningful sense, and remarkably little acknowledgement that raising young children single-handedly day after day represented genuinely demanding, exhausting work in its own right. A mother who expressed real exhaustion or genuine ambivalence about the constant demands of full-time childcare risked being read, by the prevailing standards of the decade, as somehow deficient in natural maternal feeling, a judgment that pushed a great many women to quietly internalize and privately carry feelings of real guilt and inadequacy about entirely normal, entirely human responses to genuinely demanding, unrelenting work. Financial dependence, too, sat quietly at the center of a great many 1950s marriages, shaping a woman's actual practical freedom far more than the decade's cheerful rhetoric of domestic partnership ever fully acknowledged. A married woman throughout this decade typically could not open a bank account, apply for a credit card, or secure a loan in her own name without her husband's signature and explicit consent, a legal and financial reality that meant even a woman managing her household's day-to-day spending with real skill and real competence had, in practice, remarkably little direct access to or control over her family's actual overall financial resources. This financial dependence became particularly stark in marriages experiencing real strain, since a woman contemplating leaving a difficult or unhappy marriage faced the genuinely daunting practical question of how she would actually support herself and her children afterward in a job market that remained, throughout this decade, considerably more limited and considerably lower paid for women than for men, particularly for a woman who had left the paid workforce entirely upon marriage, as the overwhelming social expectation of the era strongly encouraged. Even household allowances, however generous, came with their own quiet psychological weight. A woman required in many marriages to account for and justify her spending to her husband in a way he was rarely expected to reciprocate regarding his own, an imbalance that could leave even a financially comfortable housewife feeling, in some genuine and lasting sense, less like an equal partner in the marriage and more like a well-provided-for dependent within it. Appearance, too, exacted its own steady, largely unacknowledged toll across the decade, a demand considerably heavier than simple personal vanity. A housewife was expected, per the era's relentless advice literature, to maintain her figure, her grooming, and her general attractiveness throughout marriage with real, sustained discipline, since a wife who let herself go, in the era's own unsparing phrase, risked genuine blame, both social and marital, should her husband's attention or affection wander elsewhere. A double standard that placed the entire weight of a marriage's ongoing romantic vitality onto the wife's continued physical upkeep alone. Diet culture, though the term itself wouldn't emerge for some years yet, was already a genuine, significant presence throughout the decade's women's magazines, promoting careful calorie counting and an increasingly narrow beauty ideal that many women pursued with real anxiety, particularly following childbirth, when a new mother was expected to quickly regain her pre-pregnancy figure, even while managing the genuinely exhausting demands of caring for a newborn largely without help. Beneath the bright lipstick and the carefully set hair so consistently featured in the decade's advertising, a great many women carried real, private insecurity about measuring up to a standard that was, in practice, considerably harder to sustain than the smiling advertisements ever let on. Neighborhood social life, too, carried its own quieter undercurrent of judgment and pressure that ran directly counter to the genuine warmth and friendship it could also, in fairness, provide. A housewife standing within her own suburban community was watched and quietly assessed constantly by the very same neighbours she relied on for companionship. The state of her lawn, the cleanliness of her windows, the behaviour of her children, and the general appearance of her home all serving as visible, ongoing evidence of her competence and character, judged with a scrutiny not entirely unlike the social observation faced by her Victorian counterparts nearly a century before. Gossip moved efficiently and often unforgivingly through these close suburban networks. A woman who appeared, even briefly, to be struggling, whether with housekeeping, with her marriage, or simply with visible unhappiness, risking real, if quiet, social judgment from the very community she might most need genuine support from. This meant that even a woman experiencing real private distress often felt real, additional pressure to maintain a composed, cheerful public front specifically for her neighbours' benefit, compounding whatever difficulty she was already privately carrying with the further exhausting labour of concealing it convincingly from the people around her. Education and the road not taken too sat quietly at the back of a great many 1950s housewives' minds, a genuine and often unspoken source of private loss. A significant number of women entering marriage during this decade had received real, substantial education. Some had attended college, and a portion had even begun promising careers or professional training before marriage, and the arrival of children redirected their lives almost entirely into the domestic sphere the culture insisted was their true and proper calling. A woman who had once studied literature, or nursing, or business with real seriousness and real ambition might find herself, a decade later, spending her days almost entirely on housework and childcare. Her earlier training and earlier intellectual life quietly set aside, sometimes permanently, in a culture that offered remarkably few accepted pathways for a married mother to meaningfully re-enter either higher education or a serious career, regardless of how capable or how genuinely eager she remained to do so. This particular loss rarely announced itself as tragedy in any dramatic, visible way, since a woman experiencing it usually continued outwardly to perform the cheerful, competent domestic role expected of her, but it surfaces again and again with real and unmistakable clarity in later interviews, memoirs, and survey research conducted with women of exactly this generation, a persistent, quiet ache for an entire different version of a life that had once, briefly, seemed genuinely possible before circumstance and expectation closed steadily and firmly around it. A significant number of women throughout this decade also carried the quiet, particular strain of wanting or needing paid work outside the home, a desire the surrounding culture treated with real ambivalence at best. Although the post-war years had seen a real, if partial, retreat from the higher rates of female employment achieved during wartime, a genuinely substantial number of married women continued working outside the home throughout the 1950s, often in part-time or lower-paid positions, and these women frequently navigated real, unspoken tension between the income and independence their work provided and the prevailing cultural message that a truly devoted wife and mother belonged at home full-time. A woman who worked, even for entirely practical financial reasons, sometimes concealed or downplayed this fact within her own social circle, aware that some neighbours and even some family members read a working wife as an implicit, uncomfortable suggestion that her husband couldn't adequately provide for the family alone. For women who genuinely wanted meaningful work for its own sake, rather than purely financial necessity, this tension cut even deeper, a real, sustained internal conflict between genuine personal ambition and a culture offering remarkably little social permission to pursue it openly, while also fulfilling the demanding full-time expectations of suburban wife and motherhood simultaneously. Pregnancy and childbirth, too, carried their own particular, largely unspoken weight throughout this decade, shaped by medical practices that could feel, to a modern listener, genuinely disorienting. Twilight sleep, a combination of morphine and scopolamine administered during labour in many hospitals throughout this era, left a labouring woman conscious but with little or no memory of the birth itself afterward, a practice defended at the time as a genuine mercy sparing women the pain of childbirth, yet one that also meant a great many mothers experienced the actual birth of their own children as a strange, disorienting blank, pieced together only second-hand from what nurses and husbands later told them. Fathers throughout most of this decade remained almost entirely excluded from the delivery room itself, waiting instead in a separate room down the hall, smoking and pacing, in a scene so thoroughly repeated across the era's films and television that it became its own instantly recognizable cultural shorthand, while the mother laboured largely among strangers, however competent and well-meaning the attending medical staff genuinely were. Breastfeeding, too, fell dramatically out of fashion throughout these years, hospital-based formula feeding actively promoted by physicians as the modern, scientifically superior choice. And a woman who wished to breastfeed her own child sometimes found herself gently but firmly discouraged by medical staff who considered the practice somewhat old-fashioned, one more small personal decision quietly shaped by prevailing medical opinion rather than by the mother's own preference alone. Household technology, for all its genuine benefit, also introduced its own new, largely unspoken sources of anxiety into a housewife's daily life throughout this decade. A woman managing a kitchen full of the era's newest appliances carried real, ongoing responsibility for their proper use and maintenance, and a malfunctioning washing machine or a temperamental new oven. Genuinely common occurrences given how rapidly this technology was still evolving, could derail an entire day's carefully planned schedule, a frustration a woman often absorbed quietly and alone rather than treating as a legitimate source of stress worth voicing aloud. Advertising throughout this decade also promoted a genuinely demanding, ever-rising standard of household perfection. Floors so clean they shone, laundry so white it practically glowed, and a woman who fell short of these relentlessly marketed standards, through no genuine fault of her own beyond simple human limitation, frequently carried real private guilt about it, measuring her own daily competence against an advertising ideal that no actual household could realistically sustain day after day without exception. The sheer volume of new products and new techniques a housewife was expected to master and keep pace with throughout this decade, waxes, polishes, cleaning agents, and appliances updated with genuine regularity, added its own steady, cumulative mental load to an already demanding daily workload. Beauty standards and physical self-presentation, too, exacted a genuinely demanding toll that ran considerably deeper than simple daily grooming. The decade's fashionable silhouette, a narrow cinched waist achieved through structured undergarments worn steadily through long days of housework, produced real, sustained physical discomfort for many women. Discomfort accepted quietly as simply the ordinary price of looking properly put together. Hair, too, required real weekly investment. A set styled at a local salon and carefully maintained between visits through an elaborate nightly routine of pin curls and hairnets. One more small recurring demand on a woman's already limited private time. A housewife who let any of this daily maintenance slip, even briefly during a period of genuine illness or genuine exhaustion, often felt real, if largely unspoken. Anxiety about how this lapse might be perceived by a husband, by neighbours, or simply by her own harshly internalised sense of what a properly composed woman owed the world around her each and every day, regardless of how she actually felt underneath it. Race and class, too, shaped this decade's experience of housewifery in ways the era's own popular imagery almost entirely erased. And it's worth pausing here honestly before we move toward the evening's close. The image of the contented suburban housewife promoted so relentlessly throughout this decade's magazines, films, and advertising was, almost without exception, a white, middle to upper class image, and black women, Latina women, and working class women of every background navigated a genuinely different, and in most cases considerably harder, set of daily realities throughout these very same years, frequently working outside the home out of real economic necessity, while still shouldering the same domestic expectations placed on their wealthier counterparts, with none of the labour-saving appliances or hired domestic help that eased at least some of the physical burden for women higher up the economic ladder. Suburban housing developments built throughout this decade were, in a great many cases, explicitly restricted through discriminatory lending practices and outright racial covenants, meaning the very geography of comfortable tree-lined suburban contentment we've spent this evening sitting inside was itself built, quite deliberately, to exclude a large portion of American women entirely, regardless of their own aspirations toward exactly the same domestic stability and comfort. This deeper context doesn't erase the genuine hardship carried by the women we've already sat with tonight, but it does complicate, in an important and honest way, any single uniform picture of what it actually meant to be a housewife across this particular decade. Religious and community expectation, too, added its own steady layer of pressure to a great many women's daily lives throughout this era, one worth acknowledging honestly here. Regular church, synagogue, or other religious attendance remained a near universal expectation for a respectable suburban family throughout the 1950s, and a housewife typically bore primary responsibility for her family's religious life in practical terms, ensuring children were dressed and ready, coordinating the family's participation in religious school and related community activities, and often taking on additional volunteer responsibilities within her congregation, on top of her already considerable domestic workload. This religious community offered many women genuine comfort, genuine friendship, and a genuine sense of purpose and belonging, and it would be wrong to frame it purely as burden. But it also added its own real expectations around visible moral respectability, a housewife's public conduct, her children's behaviour, and even her marriage's outward appearance of harmony, all watched, in a fairly direct sense, by a religious community whose good opinion mattered enormously to a family's broader social standing within the neighbourhood as a whole. Aging within this particular role too brought its own quiet, largely unspoken anxiety as the decade wore on and a woman's children gradually grew older and more independent. A housewife who had built her entire sense of daily purpose and daily identity around the intensive, hands-on demands of raising young children often found herself facing real, if rarely voiced, uncertainty as those children entered school and eventually adolescence, requiring steadily less of the constant minute-by-minute care that had shaped her days for over a decade, leaving behind hours that could feel, to some women, genuinely disorienting rather than simply freeing. The culture around her offered remarkably little guidance or acknowledgement for this particular transition, no widely recognized concept yet existing for the kind of identity questions a woman might reasonably face once her most demanding, most defining years of full-time motherhood began, gradually but unmistakably to wind down. Some women found renewed purpose in expanded volunteer work, in relationships with grown children and eventually grandchildren, or in the paid employment that became more socially acceptable for older women whose children no longer required constant supervision, but the transition itself, the quiet, private recalibration of an entire adult identity built so completely around a role now naturally receding remained, for many women, a genuinely difficult passage navigated largely alone and largely without any real public conversation to help guide her through it. It would be dishonest to suggest that every 1950s housewife experienced her life as one of quiet suffering, since a great many women found real, genuine satisfaction and pride in the homes, marriages, and children they built and raised during this decade, and the picture we've sat with tonight shouldn't erase that genuine happiness where it truly existed. But it would be equally dishonest to let the decade's carefully polished public image stand entirely unexamined, because a significant, and at the time largely unspoken, current of real distress ran beneath a great deal of that polished surface, a current that would, within just a few short years of the decade's close, finally begin finding public language and public acknowledgement through a wave of writing and research, explicitly naming exactly the hidden burden we've spent this evening quietly sitting with together. So let the last lamp in that bright gleaming kitchen dim slowly now, the radio falling silent, the pot roast long since cleared away, and the dishes finally, quietly done. Let the house settle into the particular stillness of a suburban evening long after the children have finally gone to sleep, the husband's own reading lamp clicking off somewhere down the hall, the whole bright, busy performance of the day finally permitted to rest. You don't need to carry any of this weight further tonight either, whatever it stirred in you. Let it rest here in the dark, gently, alongside every woman who ever quietly carried it herself. If sitting with the hidden reality behind the 1950s housewife's smiling surface helped ease you towards sleep tonight, feel free to leave a soft tap of a thumb before your own eyes closed the rest of the way, and let us know in the comments which quiet corner of the old world you'd like us to visit next. And if you'd like more evenings exactly like this one, consider following the show so the next lamp is already dimmed and waiting for you. For now, though, none of that needs your attention. There is only the dark, settled hush of a long day finally over, and the deep, patient comfort of knowing that whatever weight was carried today can simply rest here until morning. Rest now. The kitchen is quiet. It always was underneath.